This video is a second in a series of videos to help us tackle one of the tougher objectives in Chapter 7, which is to factor trinomials in the form ax squared plus bx plus c. We're going to continue to use the guess and check strategy, and we're going to try to use this video to point out some other things that you can do to maybe cut down on the number of guesses that you take. We'll remind you of what the you know what the strategy is in terms of making these guesses. And then we're also going to give you a little bit of hope that maybe the amount of guessing and checking that we have to do, maybe guessing and checking at all, is something we could eventually get rid of. But in this video, the new added twists are going to be, we're going to take a look at how a negative C value impacts the outer plus the inner, which has been the check portion of guess and check. And then at the end, we'll point out something about the outer and inner products that are going to help us get more efficient in factoring if we choose to try to get more efficient. So the example we're going to use is this one here, where we're going to try to factor the trinomial 5x squared plus 18x minus 8. And what we've realized so far is when you see something like that, where there's three terms and that symmetry, where there's kind of that x squared and then that gradual decrease of x's, and then the end there's a constant, we've figured out that there's some things we don't have to guess about. We're pretty confident that we're going to end up with, if this factors in, it's going to factor as two binomials. Next thing is, we're pretty confident that if we put an x term in the front of each of those two binomials in each of the sets of parentheses, we'll account for the x squared term that we see in the multiplied version. And we'll also make room for the negative 8 to occur, because if we leave the variables out of these second terms, then we're creating a constant here when we multiply. Now, as for the guessing piece, the guessing came down to, how are we going to split the 5x squared? In previous videos, the lead coefficient, the a as we call it in this general form, had more pairs of factors than 5. So this is actually a pretty good start for us, because there's only one way you can break up a 5x squared. It's going to be an x and a 5x, or maybe a 5x and an x, but I'd say there's only one way. So I think we could safely do that. And if we just are willing to rearrange where we put the factors of 8, then we can safely, consistently always go with the 1x and a 5x, and we'll figure out which one works. And I hope you don't mind, but I'm going to take away that 1, because we're just used to seeing x, and we know that means 1x. Next, the negative 8 is the piece where we're going to have to do a lot more guessing, because there are a decent number of factor pairs of 8. Not too many, but 1 and 8, 2 and 4. You can see that there's at least going to be some combinations we have to work through. So let's start off with one of them, and we'll start off with, again, you have to try to be systematic. So I'm going to go with the smallest of the two factors first, and I'm going to start with the positive of the two factors first, just so I can keep track of what I'm doing. And I'm going to guess then that the continuation of what I started on the left-hand side of your screen here is going to be this. That would account for the 5x squared. It's a good guess considering that. It would also be a good guess considering the negative 8. And if you remember from the last video, the check comes in when you check your outer product and your inner product and see what we've created. We've created an outer product of negative 8x, an inner product of positive 5x. And what we've learned is that if you add those two things together and you get your middle term in the trinomial, you're good. And unfortunately, our first guess, we weren't lucky. We ended up with a negative 3x as a sum, not a positive 18x. So we conclude that that is not the best guess. Let's not go too far, though. Let's try to be systematic. Let's think of some things we could do to tweak this. Well, we could tweak the location of the positive 1 and the negative 8. Because when you have a 5x here that's creating an inner product, it's going to be very different than if you had a 1x here that was creating an inner product, or vice versa. If your negative 8 is here, you're going to get a different outer and inner if you had a negative 8 here. So let's try that one with the negative 8 there and the positive 1 there. So same factor pair, except a different location. Check the outer and inner. And we find out that we get a negative 39x, not a positive 18x. You might start realizing that you're going to not have to do a whole lot of math sometimes, because I know right away this is going to be a negative sum, and I'm looking for a positive sum, so you can start getting a little bit quicker on your checks, but that's out. Moving on, we have our next factor pair, and it's still 1 and an 8, but now we're switching where the negative is. And I probably should have mentioned this. In the last video, we knew that the example we had was either going to be, we were going to split up this C as either a couple of positives or a couple of negatives. And that's because the C was a positive sign in front of the C. But I hope you've kind of caught on to the fact that if this is a negative 8, the way you multiply two things together and make a negative is if one is positive and one is negative. And what it ends up doing is these outer and inner sums, the negative 3 and the negative 39, it's actually it might feel a little bit to some of you like it's subtracting, because when you're adding things with opposite signs, you get a kind of smaller pile at the end. So a few impacts of this C are that we know that when we split up the constant, we're going to have one positive, one negative. And then when you're adding, you're just going to be a little bit more careful with signs. Let's move on. So we're going to now do our -1 and our +8. So we will still build around the x and the 5x, and we'll put our -1 here and our 8 this time. Check our outer and inner, and that's a 3x. That's no good. Next, we'll keep the same numbers. We'll switch the location, and we get an outer and inner of -x and 40x, +39. That's no good. Okay. Next, I think we need to move past our 1s and 8s because we've done every pairing we can think of, and let's go to our 2 and 4. And once again, trying to be systematic, I'll go with my smaller numbers positive just so I know I get all my possibilities. Let's try that. That's going to take care of that's a good guess because of this and this. Let's check. -4x and +10x is a +6x. That's not what we wanted. Okay, that's out. We will switch the location, and I get a 2x and a -20x, and that's a -18x, and that's no good. But hold on one second. -18x. And I was hoping for a +18x. So yeah, that's not the right factorization, but I think since we were that good, maybe we know where we're headed now. Because what we did was we made a +2 as an outer product and a -20 as an inner product, and that created a -18 as our total. If we just had the opposite signs on these two things, we could get that done. And I don't want to change signs on my lead terms. But I think my next guess is going to be, no matter where I am in my system, is I'm going to make this a -2 and this a +4, because I know my 2 is still intact, my 20 is still intact with opposite signs, and 18 is still intact. But now what we need, we have our +20 and our -2 for a +18. So we found our factored expression. So you're sitting there thinking, well, this is about a 5-minute video at this point, and you're supposed to be working on efficiency, and it's not efficient yet. Well, help is coming, but we're going to have to do a little bit of observations first. So let's real quickly observe before we wrap up this video and give you a couple of easier guess and check examples. Let's see what we have. I want to point something out to you. More efficient approaches are going to take advantage of something that we're going to see here. And that is that the outer and inner products from our guesses, we've been adding those outer and inner products together, and we've been checking it against the middle. But I want to point something out about them. The first outer and inner product was a -8x and a 5x. And I know that we added them together to check to see this, but let's take a quick look at their product. The -8x and the 5x have a product of -40x squared. By itself, that's not impressive. But you look at the next outer and inner product, the x and the -40x, that has a product of -40x. And if you look at every single other guess that we've made, including the one that was successful, every single one of those products of my outer and inners are a -40x squared. There's got to be something that we can take advantage of. So as you move down the line, you're going to see that our efficient strategies, they're going to lie within us finding the -40 first. And I say -40 because the x squared is going to be a distractor. And then picking the correct factor pairs of -40. Because we learned early, if you try to find things that multiply together to make a number, your list is going to be a lot shorter than all these combinations we've been trying to work through. Other piece of information is our next efficient strategy is going to rely on grouping. So when you see a problem set that follows this video, there's going to be a little review of all your factoring, including factoring by grouping. And that grouping, that 4-term factoring, that's going to be a pretty important one. So if you're having questions with it, make sure you maybe watch the old video or track down some help from a teacher. Thanks.